is truly my pleasure to introduce our special guest, Chacku Mathai. I've known Chacku, my gosh, since your days at the New York Psychiatric Rehab Association. So, gosh, Chacku, is that like 30 years? Oh, good Lord. Anyway, our dear friend and colleague Chacku is an Indian American who was actually born in Kuwait and became involved in the consumer survivor ex-patient movement when he was 15 years old. His personal experiences, I captured this off some document, with trauma, suicide attempts, and disabling mental health and substance abuse issues really led him into becoming an advocate for much better, relevant, responsive community-based services. He's held several executive level positions, including being the CEO of the Mental Health Association in Rochester, which is in New York for you Californians. And I first met him when he was the Associate Executive Director of NIAPSRIS, which is the CASRA of New York. He is currently the Project Director of a Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration Healthy Transitions Grant, which is part of the Division of Behavioral Health Services and Policy Research, Columbia University, New York State Psychiatric Institute. And the most exciting thing I get to share with you is the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law, which is the nation's premier advocacy group for civil rights, full inclusion, and equality for people with disabilities, has selected Chacku as their Advocate of the Year. So big thumbs up and round of applause for that. So by the way, if you want to hang out, the center will be honoring him at 7 p.m. Let me make sure I get this right. On November 17th at their virtual annual awards celebration, which is free. So visit the bazelon.org website to get the information about the event. And please join me and hundreds, if not thousands of people around the country in honoring Chacku on the 17th of November. So with that, let me turn it over to our presenter. We are very interested, part of CASRA's thing these days is looking at the intersectionality of institutional racism, institutional saneism, and economic inequality. So we are particularly pleased that Chacku has chosen to take some time out of his very busy schedule to share his thoughts on these very important and timely issues. So Chacku, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Betty. Thank you so much for the introduction and the appreciation for the award. While I personally, many of us feel as though when we get these awards, we don't feel very deserving, but if nothing else, if it's an opportunity to recognize all of us who have been, including yourselves, who have been at this for so long and trying to move a needle on so many different levels. Here's one where we feel like, I feel especially like we failed the most in terms of anti-racism work. And so that's why I'm so grateful you're here. There's so much work. The best I've been able to do is just keep getting up every time we get knocked down on some level or another. And so if you're like me, you're probably exhausted, you're weary, you've got some battle fatigue in terms of that regard. And, like me, you're also probably operating at 50% or something, or a little less. Even when your self-care is in place, it's just bringing you back up to that 50%. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. I'm hoping you'll be patient with me accordingly. So, as you said, I've really appreciated, first of all, CASRA's commitment over time, all these years, and especially now, to addressing inequities, and I've seen that. I've watched your commitment to it. I've watched your advocacy. We've partnered as well as while I was with NIAPRS on so many levels. And I see that there are things that we are doing that actually are making a difference in one way or another. What I'm going to make some assumptions about is that this group kind of is moving from the place of kind of talking about it to trying to be involved in a process organizationally and as organizations, right? Each of you representing organizations that are a part of CASRA that can create a framework, an actual committed framework within our movement for rehabilitation and recovery as anti-racist, to really have an anti-racist identity, to take on a commitment to a multicultural community in a way that shows up every day. So that's the hope. I'm going to share a little bit about that. I'll share my screen here with some PowerPoints. It's far from going to be adequate. So you know, it'll be a start though. So let's see what we can do. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement though. If what I like to do is really emphasize, first of all, that, you know, we are each likely participating on the unceded land of an indigenous people. For me, where I work, it's in the Lenape homeland. Where I'm living is in Rochester in Western New York. So I'm also acknowledging the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, and by honoring the sovereignty of the Six Nations, Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora. So I ask you to join me in this, in a small way, in this way, to acknowledge our people, the elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. Most of the institutions for which we work also must acknowledge that they were founded upon exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous people. So this acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment in a small way, as I said, to begin the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. And so, you know, this is part of the process. Decolonizing our experience is more than just a metaphor for our mental health intersections, as Betty put it earlier. You know, this is really a recognition of those very strong drivers of colonized practice that we are still in play with on a regular basis. And that's a very important thing to recognize. And so I'm going to make some assumptions about how much you have already heard or know about that. But so forgive me if I'm not getting into all of it. But the idea is that I encourage you to look into that, become more aware, and take some time to read up on the history of the colonization efforts around the country as well as the world, as well as the practices and the, you know, how much, for example, we you know, utilize and benefit from, for example, from slavery in the cotton industry and tobacco industries and things like that. So here we are. I you know, have placed two pictures up here on this cover slide. One, of course, George Floyd, who was killed by police and murdered in May. And you know, our protests of the video that was seen, finally being able to see what this tragic circumstance. Once again, nothing new to California, whether it was the video, one of the first earliest videos we saw in '92 with Rodney King. So, you know, these were the kinds of issues that we've been at. Many of us have been at it for a while. This was not the first time. The other picture you see is Daniel Prude, who's in Rochester, New York, who was killed by police here as well. This happened in March this year, but the video, the body cam footage that occurred or showed what occurred only came out the week after, you know, just in September 2nd. So we started protesting after that. So I share this with you because I think it's important to recognize that and if you recognize, this is those of you in Los Angeles at City Hall, and I really emphasize this priority, this sign here that says "say their names," really getting, you know, recognizing the personal nature of this. This is about each and every one of us. And when Daniel Prude died here in Rochester, many of us felt like, wow, this is us. He was one of us. And this acknowledgement of it, that whether it's the protests that occurred after George Floyd while I was in New York City or here in Rochester or out in LA, continued in Rochester. This is a street in Rochester where Daniel Prude was killed in Jefferson Avenue. And we were organizing right away. Here we are doing, in the daytime, a sit-in. We do teach-ins. During our protests, a component of our protest is to bring in ancestral practices and collective knowledge and healing practices within the process. There are a group of us that are organized emotional supporters through the protest. So we wear these orange bands and we go out, and we're the ones that people can talk to when, you know, talking about their anxiety and stress and rage and fear and grief, you know. And so that experience of doing that while also having tear gas canisters thrown at us and pepper spray bullets and rubber bullets and the cops' response to us, we're doing it all the way into the night, by the way, right? So we're, you know, it's daytime, nighttime, here we are at City Hall. You have your City Hall. This was the Rochester City Hall, a little smaller than the LA's, all right? But the idea was we were calling for change together as a community, recognizing the need for accountability. The police that killed Daniel Prude have yet to be charged with anything in this regard. So we have major issues. The thing that I want to bring up, though, to you is to recognize the response by the police to us. This was the Rochester Police Department responding with incredible force. So yeah, they were throwing tear gas canisters at us. So we were supporting each other through this process while at the same time experiencing the same violence that was perpetuated against Daniel Prude. The response to people of color who were involved in these protests, the assumption that we would be rioting and that we would be breaking things, and the spin in the media about that too. All of these things were factors that worked together to demonstrate the racist attitudes of the city of Rochester and the police department and of the administration and the communities around us. I share all this with you because this is a reflection of the current state. And this is me. Betty said I was born in Kuwait, but this is me visiting in India, in my hometown in Kerala, South India. When people ask me what is one of my favorite memories, this was one of them, because I was able to, I got on this elephant and I just saw everybody looking at me. There's a crowd of people watching me do this, by the way, the villagers in that area and my family, and they're all looking at me, seeing me, expecting me to be doing something like amazing, like as if I'm already doing something amazing. All I did was get on this elephant, but what there was a valuing of me that I so appreciated and recognized when I looked around, and when I felt so connected to this elephant. I felt connected to the land. We're an indigenous people. The mundas that you see this man wearing, it's unstitched clothing. It's part of our heritage in that regard. It's an ancestral experience that I was engaged in at that moment. Yet the reason why it was so happy for me was because that's not the experience I had here in the States. We immigrated to the United States in 1972, went to New York City, and then went upstate to Rochester. Rochester was supposed to be Smugtown, where you could get work. My parents said, let's go get some work. Somebody said, let's go to Rochester. And at that time, in 1970, Rochester was no different in that sense. And right before the Civil Rights Act was passed, as well as after, with Housing Rights Act and these other issues that still needed to be addressed, the recognition was really more resentment. We were taking their jobs, we were taking their neighborhoods, we were moving into their spaces. The white community in Rochester treated this in the same way as you're seeing today, the changes only as a reversal in their experience, not progress. The young boys that you see here, watching, wondering why don't they see us? Why are they not recognizing us? I was going through this too, even as a toddler. I was seeing my father and my mother treated with hostility. My father would squeeze my hand as we walked down the street when something felt unsafe and it was a sign to go faster. I was involved in fights right away. As soon as I started in school, I was immediately taunted and bullied and threatened. I was attacked with a baseball bat with some white kids because of this color of my skin by when I was 7, 8 years old. And I had to go to the hospital, but I refused. When I came to, after I felt everybody scattered, when I walked home, bleeding from this skull fracture, I swore I wouldn't tell my parents what happened because they would never let me go out again. So this was the trauma that we were experiencing. So it wasn't safe on my sidewalk, at the school, in the bathroom, in the coat room, in the classroom. Teachers told me to speak English. You're in America now. This was the energy of the time, is what I'm trying to get at. So not only were my experiences with suicide and psychosis and mental health issues and substance use issues a factor, guess what else was a factor? Racism, xenophobia. These were social determinants of health and my health. These are direct correlates. In fact, actual, in my opinion, causes of my experiences. my PTSD, all of these issues, the stress, all of the health issues are factors that are there. And so that is what we're facing when we start to recognize that we need to come forward in some kind of way about an anti-racist identity, because what we are recognizing is that our society has really embraced this idea that race is a biological fact, when in fact, still we know it's a biological fiction, but the idea of it is still a sociological reality, right? The attitudes about people are still very much clearly defined across racial lines, and that race itself, I'm going to repeat this theme, is a social construction on power, just like psychiatry and the construction of mental illness is a social construction for power. So I don't know if I can't see the chat right now, so I'm not going to I'm going to hold, I'm hoping you'll have some thoughts about this. I have a lot more content to share, but here's a quote by a Sri Lankan activist that if anybody asked me what, somebody actually did ask me when I came back to Rochester one year, they said, hey, what's the one thing, you want me to know about you? And I gave them this quote. I said, so when we try to bring about change in our societies, we are treated first with indifference, then with ridicule, and then with abuse, and then with oppression. And finally, the greatest challenge is thrown at us. We are treated with respect. This is the most dangerous stage. So I'm really curious what you're thinking about this quote. Why is that challenge? Why is that respect a challenge? So, think about that, or throw it into the chat and offer some thoughts about it. Here's my reflection on it. My reflection is that it's really that we're always at risk of recreating the qualities that outraged us in the first place. That no matter how well we think we're doing, we can't let up on the reflection about our own implementation. We can't pour cement in changes that we've made without reflecting on whether they're actually causing some of the same issues we've been creating in the first place. Are we bringing in the very same white supremacy values in one way or another without realizing it? That's the kind of concept that I'm hoping we can think through. And I think about that all the time, especially when I'm entering into positions of power and authority and leadership. What does that mean for me in terms of how I operate? What are the things that I need to do differently in order to be different, in order to really change the nature of what we do? So when we talk about an anti-racist framework, there are several levels of information out there about this. I think what I'm looking for is for you to kind of just reflect on a few of these. So this is Ibram Kendi's framework, where really the simplest way to look at it, and I really appreciate him for this, where Professor Kendi says, look, every policy and every institution is producing or sustaining either racial equity or racial inequity. So what you want to do is just follow the inequities, which is why I appreciated Kazra's attention to inequities. If you're looking at inequities, you're actually looking at racist policies. That's where you bring it back to. What are the policies that actually created the inequity in the first place? So essentially inequity, there's a lot of different definitions out there, but it's essentially at the very basic level, it's when two or more racialized groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. So the question is, how can we really view our policies? It's either one or the other, by the way. This is where it is binary, where we do want to recognize that there is no neutral space in this factor. There's no neutral policy. There's either a policy that's producing an inequity, or there's a policy that's reversing that inequity. And that's the context that we want to think about. One of the things that I really appreciated about this was that he also raised the concept that, look, the word racist is not a pejorative. It's not meant to be something to call somebody as a bad word and shut down a conversation. White supremacy actually used it that way, or turned it that way, in order to make us stop talking about it. When in reality, it's a descriptor. It's a descriptor of a policy. It's a descriptor of an inequity. It's a descriptor of an attitude that produces that policy. So let's think about it that way a little bit more, so that we can move into some of the discussions about what policies might actually look like in that context. First of all, just in the context of here you see, the Greenboro 4, by the way, at the diner. I mean, these initiatives, this idea that the very function of racist ideas and any kind of bigotry more broadly is to manipulate us into seeing people as the problem. That's something important for us to think about. Where are we seeing people as the problem instead of the policies that ensnare us? And what are some examples of that? So I want to move to one right away. I'm going to jump ahead a couple of things, but one of the things, I'll come back to this in a minute, but one of the biggest examples of that is involuntary outpatient commitment. How, at least in New York, and I've been watching some of the data, and including in California, and this is otherwise kind of euphemistically referred to as assisted outpatient treatment, which is not what I refer to it as. Involuntary outpatient commitment blames the person. It expects the person through a black robe to be accountable for the changes that need to be made, when in fact, it's actually about systems coordination and accountability. What we've learned from our review of the data, and this has been going on for ever since the law was passed, that IOC impacts African Americans so much more, 5 times more than whites. And this is clearly in the data. However, this is what I want you to recognize that's so compelling to me, that the legislature 1 year right before it was sunsetting, was asked to research this racial disparity. So we had the New York Lawyers of Public Interest made a big statement about it and basically brought up the point, with advocacy from NIAPers and all those of us who were at the time talking about it, saying, look, you have a disproportionate number of people of color. And at the time, it was not just blacks, it was blacks and Spanish-speaking Latinx community were both disproportionately under IOC orders. Now, the Latinx is still there at a high level, but not at such a disproportionate rate as the black community. They actually did a research paper, and the same researchers that I actually thought, were trying to take an honest look at this. Jeffrey Swanson, Marvin Schwartz, Richard Van Dorn, some of the people that, very highly respected researchers in a very highly respected journal published a report that says racial disparities, are they real? Are they real? The assumption of that research was, well, maybe because there's so much disproportionate already overrepresentation of the black community in the mental health system and as a whole, this isn't really our problem from an involuntary outpatient commitment perspective. This isn't just an issue, a reflection of the broader whole. And so therefore it's not really a disparity, the fact that we're forcing more, putting more black people on court orders, when actually what they actually said, could this be a way that we're actually getting more people out of hospital and into treatment? They actually spun it that way in a journal. So the very racist idea that the only way to address the black community was to force them into care was what was justified in that research article and published, by the way. I don't know one journal committee, peer review journal that would actually support that today, but it got through. And that's the kind of thing that gets justified in policy and used to justify policy. I'm really curious about your thoughts about that. I know that Kazer's been a strong advocate against forced treatment and in the past, but I'm not quite sure where you stand. Something looking at Betty's and Kazer's argued that we are in favor of forced treatment. We believe that the system societies need to be forced to do the right thing by their community members. Okay, so a force of community, is that a force of the services? Is that what you're getting at, Betty? I think I understand you there. Okay, well, yeah, I mean that fits the focus of the research, was that the system needs to be held accountable, not the individual. It's not about placing the restrictions on the individual. So let me kind of go back to this concept of what is it that an anti-racist community would do, or a movement would do, and one of those things is commit. And I really want to emphasize this, commit to talking to each other about race. I mean, where are you having these conversations? Is it just a token presentation here and there? Or is it, what I mean? Like, what are you going to do to actually analyze this together? So part of it is learning how to engage, sustain, and deepen conversations about race in an interracial way. A lot of times we do affinity groups, and I don't have a problem with affinity group. I think there's a lot of need for them in many respects. However, we also have a need for interracial conversations. Because if you don't, you never get to the co-analysis. We never get to the place where racialized communities, people who are in policy-making positions actually talk together about what needs to be done differently. And I brought up one of the biggest ones, right? Involuntary outpatient commitment is one, but policing is one of the biggest ones. The role of policing. Policing itself, all it offers is violence. It has tools of violence. That's it. And we continuously use policing for some of the issues that we need each other the most. Organizations like your own, to address homelessness, to address substance use, to address mental health issues, to address the fear and trauma in communities. These are not issues that require police. So recognizing that and being able to stand with organizations that, and by the way, I was one of the things I was really appreciating about NIAPRS is more recently Harvey Rosenthal worked with me and others to collaborate with Black Lives Matter. We've been calling upon organizations to collaborate with Black Lives Matter and other organizations that are focused on the priorities of the Black community for a long time. And there's so many ways that can be done. And when it doesn't happen, those same communities can get oftentimes even given the wrong information, about what needs to be done in mental health. Fortunately, Hawk Newsom in New York City, for example, in greater New York, he stood up for Deborah Danner, who died, at the hands of police in New York City years back. And I remember that. And so, that he's been an ally in that regard to our lived experience, mental health lived experience, psychiatric survivor community, for example. Bringing that together wasn't as difficult, but I'm curious about what that looks like in California. How do we bring more partnership with are you showing up? Are you a presence? Do people see you and recognize you when you show up or are you only doing the gospel choir once a year at Christmas time? The idea is show up on a regular basis. And then when it's time to actually move together, you can be trusted to move with them as an ally. When we had the protests here in Rochester, I had just moved back 1 week prior. 1 week prior. And the fact that I was trusted by the Black community to be part of the organizing as meant so much to me. But it wasn't just because I'm an organizer, it was because I have all the work that we've done together over the last, decades, right? The idea was that, and I also, by the way, because of that work we've done together over decades, I knew my place. I wasn't here to be a leader. I was here to be a follower in that. I was going to decenter my voice and center theirs. When it came down to bring psychiatric survivor roles and perspectives, of course I was going to be there with it. But I was also emphasizing the priority of Black community leaders who are in there to be able to talk. So co-analysis is part of the feature of this. We not only have to raise our voice, but part of the liberation work that we do is really about, I guess the best way to put it, maybe Paulo Freire puts it the best in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is that, the first task is of course liberating our voice, but the second, is about the contradictions within our circumstances that need to be analyzed. There's also a task that really addresses the oppressor, because the oppressor cannot dehumanize themselves. There needs to be a relationship with the oppressed in order for that to occur. So now that's kind of heady stuff, but my point is that you have to step into the situation, right? Actually be in the rooms where the conversations are happening and the policies are being happening. And that's what you guys are good at. You've been doing that. So let's kind of keep that up. Some ideas to think about. I've kind of, and this is gonna, I hope you don't take this too personally, but a lot of times I felt like we've used euphemisms quite a bit. We code our language, we use system language, even peer, consumer. I don't use that terminology personally. I've kind of had to use it because the movement. When we talked about peer support, we weren't talking about an identity. We were talking about a relational process. That wasn't the intention of the word peer. The intention of the word peer was not to call me a peer. I'm an ex-patient. I'm a psychiatric survivor. That identity is what I'm bringing forward into the room. The fact that I can offer support to others through that lived experience is something we've called peer support for decades now. But we didn't kind of switch that to suddenly call ourselves peers. Same thing with consumer. AOT, as I explained, that's a euphemism for involuntary outpatient commitment. Even stigma is a euphemism, in my opinion, for discrimination. Let's talk about what it is. Let's not make the words, let's not make the experience more comfortable for us. You know, if it's uncomfortable to have an ex-patient in the room, that's why I'm there. You know, that's why I'm there. Compliance is another word that I feel like has been kind of turned into, people are using engagement as the same as combined. Mark Raggins himself, who's one of your former speakers here, he himself, engagement is not compliance. He was one of the first people I remember saying that. I remember thinking, wow, so many people think engagement, compliance, they use those words interchangeably. And the other thing I realized, I mean, when I became CEO of the MHA of Rochester with Betty, as Betty noted, you know, my press release said from patient to president and CEO. The reason I put that out there is because I wanted people to, I didn't like the word patient any more than anyone else, but the reality was that's what they recognized, you know, as my identity, or as an identity. They go, oh, wow. So an ex-patient became president and CEO of a mental health organization. That's never happened in this area. A person of color became a CEO of an organization, a mental health organization. That's never happened in this area. People needed to recognize what we were talking about. Nobody understood the word peer. It doesn't mean I want to educate them about peer support. It meant that I needed to make sure they understood. Words like community integration, I get it. I understand that that's part of the rehab kind of mindset. But remember, if we're doing this behave like us, it might as well be assimilation. Are we allowing mainstreaming of unusual behavior to suddenly become another, you know, arm of psychiatry and social control? That's not what we're looking for. Inclusion without equity is still racism. Getting people into jobs and other kinds of opportunities, great. But if they're still remember what we used to call them, food, filled, filing, furniture, and sometimes flowers, right? Is kind of the 5F program approach. Now, I was my first job, but from a rehab program was a dishwasher job. I was practicing with suits and all kinds of things, trying to, you know, thinking I was getting into another option. Even our financing strategies for peer support, maybe even rehab, you might want to think about it, but even our financing strategies, in my opinion, need to be rethought about if they are creating inequities, which I believe they are racist. There are some other ways in which we've been operationalizing racist policies. One of those ideas is, you know, leadership development programs. There's an assumption that we need to help people develop leadership. I don't see it that way. You need to discover leadership. The leadership is right under your nose. But I think developing leadership programs, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying we don't need skills. Everyone needs skills, and we all need to develop that in the process. But that kind of thing, in the absence of an equity strategy, an organizational equity strategy will also become, in and of itself, an assumption of inadequacy or inability. Again, the token kind of leadership roles, placing us on boards or conference committees or research committees or an occasional keynote isn't enough. We need to really see, and even recognition awards. All right, these are all things that I worry about, are great kind of things that put a little momentary spotlight on something, but they end up really just being token. And I worry about these being weak attempts. And then we end up having inequitable leniency. You know, I've seen that happen in so many different ways. There are organizations that would prefer to use volunteer interpreters rather than hiring multilingual staff and creating investments in that. Where that's a policy direction. That's certainly something that CASRA could pick up as a priority, if you haven't already, is pushing the financing of interpreters to be available. And then finally, there's just some general attitudes that drive policy. I mean, I think the fear of being in Black and brown neighborhoods and spaces with the assumptions that they're dangerous spaces has driven a lot of outreach and engagement programs to do things that they normally wouldn't do in other spaces. Whether it's not sending somebody out at a certain time, or requiring other, or just not going, just not even reaching certain communities. We want to pay attention to that. The other thing that I've noticed is that there tends to be a rejection or an exclusion of certain survivor and ex-patient language, perspectives, and literature. I mean, some of the greatest leaders of our movement, Sally Zimman in particular, and Ray Unzicker, you know, as people have come from your area that if not for their literature, I would not, Judy Chamberlain, if not for their literature on our East Coast here, I wouldn't be here. I'm raised by this movement. I am so grateful for their voices to have been out there, even when they were critical of psychiatry, and especially when they were critical of psychiatry or medications or the need to push information about rights. And then, of course, we need to change our research strategies and methodologies, because those that exclude or don't prioritize our ex-patient involvement at all levels are likely to be researching, kind of talking about us again without us. All right, how am I doing so far? Hope you're doing okay, hanging in there with me. I got a few more minutes here. I got a couple things I want to say a little bit more. You know, so Dr. Cameron Jones, she's another researcher that provided another framework around racism, the different levels in which, you know, so there's internalized racism, individually mediated racism, structural and institutional. Again, I kind of encapsulate racism into these policies, these very powerful policies that produce inequities. So these other frameworks definitely are worth paying attention to. The other one is, as you mentioned earlier, Betty, was intersectionality, recognizing that, you know, we all are coming. I mean, for me, this comes down to, you know, a very simple way of looking at it. We all carry around with us multiple social identities that have varying levels of power, privilege, marginalization, and oppression. All right. So what that means for me is, for example, just as an ex-patient, yeah, I have various issues around my marginalization and oppression. You can call the cops on me, and you know, and I'll have some problems, you know, with that interaction potentially. Or you could, you know, call Child Protective and take my kids away because of my diagnoses. You can question my judgment as soon as I start to get a little animated or talk with my hands or disagree with you. Now you can call into question my thinking because of my psychotic disorder. You know, I mean, there's a lot of different things that marginalize me as an ex-patient. On the other hand, as a man, I have a tremendous amount of power and privilege. I can go into a women's rights rally, and this is something I've done, and I've still been approached by reporters for a quote. I said, hey, don't you think you should be, this is a women's rights rally, we should be talking to women, right? I've had to direct people to the people that this is about. So whether it's same thing with the protests around Black Lives Matter, I've been asked for a quote. I'm not the one to give the quote. I've been at, you know, so criminal justice, I've been in handcuffs. Absolutely, but that doesn't put me in the position of needing, and should I be the one at the table talking about criminal justice reform for prisons? Absolutely not. We need to make sure the right people are there. So this idea that we can have these intersecting identities with varying levels of power and privilege, I think is part of the reason why community organizations, especially advocacy organizations, end up being all white. Because they identify with the oppression of one experience, let's say addiction. Let's read this experience was occurring with the addiction recovery community as well. Suddenly, because of the opioid crisis, white communities dying at a disproportionate rate, and now it's a health issue. All right. When it was the Black community, it was seen as a legal issue, and criminalized. And so that goes back quite far, I know. I mean, so like this, we're going way back into our history there, but the emergence of more issues from the needs of certain communities, we want to be able to recognize where we do have power and privilege and utilize that, leverage that well to actually prop up and center the voices of people we need. So lastly, I kind of want to go into what you can do as organizations. One of the things that is often recognized is that many organizations say they want to be multicultural, and really, unfortunately, what ends up happening is they only allow people and cultures who adapt or conform to their cultural norms. So if you haven't heard about the fox and the stork, Aesop's fable, have you heard that story before, anyone? Check it out. But here's my retelling of it. Real simply, the fox and the stork meet. They're very excited to, Fox thinks how cool would it be to have a stork for a friend. The stork thinks how cool would it be to have a fox for a friend. They do want diversity in their lives. The fox brings the stork over for dinner, lays out a plate, and the stork with her long beak, she can't touch it while he's lapping away at the milk. Well, she brings him over to dinner, and She has this vase with fish at the belly of it. And because of her long beak, she's able to get at it. But the fox can only stand and watch. So it wasn't their desire for diversity that brought them together or excluded them. It was, in fact, the way they set the table. The daily habits, the minutia of how we operate that exclude each other and make it hard to move from diversity and multiculturalism to pluralism, which is about moving together, which is about achieving things together. And that's what we're trying to achieve, to move to a place of pluralistic, collectivistic approaches. So steps that we can take if you want to really move. Here's actually, that's a picture of Hawk Newson and Celia Brown, who's one of our international leaders in our movement, and myself and another man named Garrett. So we have ideas, opportunities to, if you can just make race equity and inclusion a priority in the organization explicitly. Where is it in your strategic plan? Where is it in your operational plan, in your business plan? Really utilize that framework to be explicit about racism. Because of intersectionality, it's not enough to be anti-oppression, because race ends up always sliding off the table. Keep race on the table. Learn the key terms and definitions related to race equity. Help your teams and your communities do that. Build some capacity to talk about race issues and set some goals around that. Really get measurable about what those inequities that you're going to change are going to be. When I did this, by the way, I had the first African American Health Equity Summit in Rochester in November 2018. It was organized. We had hundreds of the people in the Black community and the mayor, and it was just incredible. So all systems came forward. We were on the front page of the Thanksgiving paper. And I wasn't invited back to my December board meeting, to an all-white board. By January, I was fired. Reversing inequities takes a little courage. I had to move to New York City, sell my house, uproot my family. A lot of consequences there. It wasn't the first time. I'm no exception. But the issue is that if we don't, and now I'm back at it again. So, we're not going away. But the reality is that these kinds of changes affect people's lives because they don't have to make these changes because it doesn't affect their lives. But as part of our charter, that we're a part of social justice movement that intersects with other movements and marginalized experiences. People's experiences with systemic oppression are accepted as real. There's a commitment on the part of our group to interrupt words and actions rooted in racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, psychiatric oppression, and other types of systemic oppression when they come up. And we join each other, and that's me, at the protests. So we need to do this. I'm so grateful to you all. I'm going to stop sharing now. We can talk more about it. I'm so interested in, I'm seeing some friendly faces in front of me, smiling at me. My close friend, Ruth, I got to call you out, Ruth. Thank you so much for being here. All right, let me stop, turn it back. Who am I turning it over to?
Well, Rhonda is our chat monitor, so she's going to give you the questions, and then there are also a lot of comments.
Okay, great.
Okay, the first one was it looked like a question: court-ordered treatment for SUD or mental health.
Well, you're asking for, if you want my opinion, I include mental health courts, drug courts. These are all, the use of force and coercion has been an assumption, a belief system that we've carried into our practices. So in terms of the data that I was talking about, it was involuntary outpatient commitment in mental hygiene law. So that's specifically around the individuals those of us who fit the criteria to be petitioned in New York to have a court order to force us into, care in a variety of ways, outpatient mental health.
Another one was, currently, we are still working hard on achieving a more equitable system, despite of utilizing MI and harm reduction. Wondering what treaters can do in the meantime when clients refuse to engage and continue to use substances heavily to self-medicate their trauma. The refusal to engage in continuous heavy use ultimately leads to untimely death amongst clients.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, the reality is that if you're seeing disengagement, we have a lot of data about disengagement. We know a lot of the reasons why people disengage from care. And a lot of it, believe it or not, is rooted in racism. There's a variety of ways in which people are treated that cause them to feel, and me in particular as well, to feel like I'm not being heard or seen or understood. Forcing people to stop using has only increased outcomes around abstinence while people are in treatment programs, right? So notice the fulfilling prophecy there, right? So the long-term recovery outcomes are only obtained when somebody's engaged in their recovery. So, the idea that we can create a clinical formulation, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to do a clinical treatment program here. Even from a rehabilitation perspective, if you're focused on engagement, not compliance, and you're recognizing that somebody is not engaged or even very low level of engagement, however, has some supports, has some skills, or maybe is high risk, and every time they leave your office, you think they're not going to be coming back because they're going to be dead after an overdose. That's something that is a challenge for all of us, absolutely. But we need to be able to use the tools of partnership, the right to say no, exchange of purpose, acknowledgement of values and culture and what's important to the person, and negotiate for the needs that we both have in the relationship. So there's a lot to say there. It's a training in and of itself, I bet, is what probably people would say. I think many of you have done those. But I've never had a situation where me forcing or supporting the forced engagement, whether it's drug court or any other kind of situation, come out with lasting effects. It's always needed to come back to an engagement issue and have what is somebody engaged in.
Is the requirement for a BA, etc., valid or more of an inequity?
For a BA, meaning a degree?
Yes, I think that's what that means.
Oh, okay, interesting. I don't have that assumption, especially because I don't have any degrees. I personally, I don't think I could even give you CEUs because I don't have any credentials. All right, so part of my reflection on this is that, yeah, I'm very fortunate that someone like me gets to present to all of you, that I get to work with researchers and PhDs and doctorates and and MDs and all these people that are willing to hear what me and others have to say. So I'm not quite sure. I mean, I value education on one level or another. I do recognize the need to have some standards. But, I always tell the story about, this peacock, that people used to see in India, and this man would he felt so bad for this peacock. It was like a genetic freak, couldn't recognize it. How could this thing survive? So he trimmed the beak and the feathers and colored it black. And now it's like a standard guinea hen that he recognized, right? He felt better. Who is it for?
Why do you think society focuses conversations and concerns about racism on people versus structures? Could it be either a feeling of powerlessness to affect racist policies and structures, or an inability to recognize the policies?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I know for me, my own inadequacies around what was possible, all right, whether it was in a relationship with somebody that I was working with towards changing in their lives, something to change in their lives, my inability to be centered around what my needs were, my feelings, my experiences, if I left that place of what I needed in the relationship, I was scared that if I didn't say, hey, when you leave, I'm scared, I don't even know what's happening to you. If I left that off the table and kept that to myself, I was perpetuating an attitude about whether this person could change or not. By sharing that, I actually presented, a two-way street in the relationship where now the person is actually engaging me about what matters to me as well. And I'm offering the belief that he can do something about that. And in fact, even calling upon his need to do something about it, asking him to do something about that. From a collectivist perspective, from an individualism kind of model, but from an ancestral collectivistic perspective, we have many more ways in which we can support each other than we currently do. Right now we want systems to do it, or we want a service to do it, or we want, we're not really thinking through this in a way that says, what are the, just use policing as get back to policing as an example. Who's going to, why do we have to rely on one discipline to determine whether somebody is dangerous, even when they already said they can't determine that somebody's dangerous, right? And I'm talking about psychiatry. Right? Why are we giving that kind of power to others when it's something we have for ourselves? So I think, yeah, there is a powerlessness there that I think you're referring to, Brian. I think if I'm seeing your experience there around, especially around racist policies and structures. But what I want to call upon you to consider is that we don't need to just stay within the scope or sphere of our power, all right? We need to exceed it. Do not accept, that we have a certain amount of authority that we have to stay in our lane about. In fact, oftentimes the Greensboro Four had to exceed the authority they were given. The authority they were given was to sit in the back of the diner, right? We need to exceed the authority we were given in order to present the change, to present the question. Now, I believe we're rivers, not statues. And the reason I talk about that is because we are constantly flowing. There are times when, even in the Hudson River, the Atlantic Ocean pushes up twice a day into the Hudson River and forces that river to move in another direction. It actually changes the flow of the river, right? But that doesn't mean the river, that who we are, stops flowing. We have this change potential. We are going to make it. We have a chant, we are winning. We have to make that belief system. Maybe this is just me being strident and adolescent and thinking that something's futile. I'm not saying. I also know that it's not up to me as a person of color alone to make this change. We don't hold the power for that, right? So I do have the power to support racist policy, so I have to better pay attention to that. But I need to call upon the people who are actually in power to make that change. Anyway.
I think that was all the questions that I saw. There were some comments when you had the question about respect.
Oh, yeah. Let's take a look at some of those. Can we get back to that? Or if somebody else had something else, I'm curious.
I have
reactions to that.
Collected them. One person said because it's new.
Because the changes, that's why it's dangerous, because it's new. Interesting. Okay.
And someone said, if you can minimize someone, it's no threat. When you have to take someone seriously, that is when you feel threatened.
Got it. Yeah. That's good.
Another person said, this is how I felt as the first female security specialist in the Air Force, Philippines.
I'm sorry, say it again. I couldn't find that.
This is from Michelle D. This is how I felt as the first female security specialist Air Force, Philippines. So I'm not sure if she's from the Philippines.
Yep. I see. Yeah, no, I get it. I mean, I see you there, Michelle. Yeah, so thanks for saying that. I mean, these are moments where we have to ask ourselves some tough questions. I mean, I was just, even with the police chief, that we called upon to resign under, these were people he was the first Black police chief, in our area. I was a friend, supporting him in that venture. Yet the accountability for the deaths that occurred under his watch, the murders that occurred under his watch needed to be there, right? So there was a loss of reflection in those moments about what still needed to change, that could happen to any of us. I guess that's what I want to get us to about that quote is, don't think you are somehow exempt or immune because you're a recovery advocate from kind of perpetuating the same issues, and I'm not immune either. So what do we do? We have to constantly reflect, get to the balcony, look at the dance floor together, have people around us that are willing to call us out and connect with us and be part of that change. Thank you.
Jessica said maybe getting respect is a challenge because people start to fuse their identity with conflict and going against the grain.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've certainly related to that, and my own. I mean, that, you know. By the way, there's a framework that I didn't get to talk about that I wanted to emphasize here, and that reminds me of it, which is, it's called the Courageous Conversation Framework by Glenn Singleton. So if you marry the Courageous Conversation Framework by Glenn with the anti-racist framework of Ibram Kendi, I can just quickly kind of show you what it looks like here on the slide, so you have it. But it's there. The idea behind this framework is that you're encouraging interracial dialogue. You're staying engaged. Stay engaged means when I feel like leaving my body and, you know, leaving the table or not being in the conversation, how do I stay engaged in a conversation that's uncomfortable? How do I speak my truth and be honest about what I need and what my fears are, or my concerns are, or what my needs are? How do I expect that there will be discomfort instead of running from discomfort? For someone like me, that's really hard. I don't know about you, but that's really hard. And then how do I expect non-closure in these conversations? So that framework alone, those agreements of courageous conversations alone, along with the 6 conditions, I think were really helpful in moving towards discomfort in a way that people started to say, Chacku, that was so uncomfortable when you came and talked to us, but can you come back and do that again? You know what I mean? There was something liberating and transformative about it that we wanted to do again.
Hi, Chacku. I guess we're out of time. We ran up into the break, but there were a few more comments, and I guess they'll be sent to you at some point.
Well, I appreciate it, everyone. I know this is inadequate, very inadequate, for those of all of us who have been working at this for so long, but I'm pleased to join the conversation, take a turn at it. I hope you do too. Take your risks, be there with each other and support each other. I'm here for you as well.
Thank you so much, Chacku. We really just are so happy to have had you here. Thanks so much, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye, you too. Thank you, Deborah. Bye, Betty.